ELI5 If space is frictionless, why can't we build perpetual motion machines there? In a sense they exist, they're just called gravitational systems that still work based on the same laws of physics, including entropy. Given enough time, even the planets orbiting stars or stars orbiting galaxies will eventually run out of energy and collapse, though they will also dissolve before that happens too, so kind of moot. There is, however, a form of friction that exists in gravitational systems called dynamical friction. This force is what causes spherical systems to become disk-like over time, thus the shapes of spiral galaxies and star systems and the rings of Saturn. First of all, space isn't completely frictionless. Second, even if it was, a perpetual motion machine is a device whose energy level supposedly never changes, so it still would not work for two reasons. One is that the machine itself loses energy as a result of the friction between its own parts and the resulting heat radiation. 2. Even if it didn't, the load that you power with it would be consuming its energy, so you wouldn't actually be able to do anything with it anyway, at least not permanently. It's just a really fancy battery at that point. A perpetual motion machine is generally understood to mean a device from which you can indefinitely extract useful work with no energy input. This contradicts the laws of thermodynamics wherever you are. While a vacuum doesn't exert wind resistance on moving objects, you can extract work out of a moving object without slowing it, makes it not perpetual. If anything, vacuum renders friction between objects higher than it would be in the presence of air. So any real machine is arguably even worse off in vacuum. The thing you're suggesting is not impossible. Why would the object in motion stop without external influence to slow it? It wouldn't. In reality, there's some amount of matter even in mostly empty space, so things do slow down over time. The question is, why would you want to? Endless motion doesn't mean endless energy. As soon as you attempted to use that motion to do any work, the system would lose energy and the object would slow down. And there are easier ways to store energy. Well, if you just spun a wheel in truly empty space, then yes, it might spin forever on its own. But in practice, what people actually want with a perpetual motion machine is really a free energy machine that not only continues its own motion but also supplies useful energy forever without diminishing. If you tried to extract energy out of your spinning wheel in space by hooking it up to a generator, it would just stop spinning as its motion got turned into electricity. If you want to do anything in the universe, you're going to need 1. Stuff matter atoms. You can't make something out of empty space. 2. You'll need to organize those atoms into a highly ordered state to do the task you want. 3. But the atoms will always be pulling against the configuration you made, spreading out their ability to be useful, creating disorder, friction, entropy. It may take a trillion years, but it is the nature of matter. It will always happen. As Newton's first law says, an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted on by an external force. You could start a magnetic disk spinning in space and it would stay spinning basically forever, but if you put some wire coils next to it to make a generator, those coils would actually apply a magnetic force, slowing the disk down. Basically, you trying to extract energy from the machine would be the drag that slows it down. Friction is not the only force that has influence over movement. Gravity is the most important that comes to my mind, but there's also other phenomena like dilatation from temperature, light exposure. There's also waves of energy that has to be taken into account. For example, all satellites have to readjust their trajectories regularly, they don't just stand there. Even our moon is not always at the same distance from us. I mean, effectively you just can't get network out of them. As far as we are concerned, the solar system is a perpetual motion machine. It will take billions of years to run down. If you try to make it do work for you, it will start running down faster. It's all running on stored gravitational energy. Some of our satellites will still be circling the Earth in 5,000 years. Space isn't frictionless. Drag is certainly very, very small, but not zero. Secondly, a perpetual motion machine is useless. For something to stay in perpetual motion, it has to be a closed system with no energy input or energy output. So one can fancy making a very expensive and completely useless item, but it probably won't be useful even if it could be made, which it couldn't. Because to get work out of it you need to take energy out, which will make it slow down and stop, even in space. But even planet or moon in orbit is not a perpetual motion machine. There is no friction, but there is gravity, and the tidal force is caused by gravity that transfer angular momentum between objects. So the Earth slows its rotation and the Moon recedes in its orbit. How would you take the energy from the device? Every method will produce waste energy, either through the physical friction or electromagnetic friction. If you use bearings you will have friction there. There are still particles in space that will occasionally hit the machine and slow it down, plus photons have momentum and can slow down a machine. There will always be loss. Space isn't frictionless. It's a vacuum, so there's not much to create friction, but it can be created in space. The act of converting energy away from kinetic energy creates friction. For example, if you put a power turbine in space and you spin it, it will still slow down, because you're converting kinetic energy to electrical energy. We can't, but it's pointless. If you throw a frisbee in space, it will spin forever until it hits something that's perpetual motion. But there isn't much point to that, because if you use that spinning to power a generator, it would eventually slow the frisbee to a halt, as its spinning energy is converted into power. First, the friction from the machine itself turning would be friction. Second, gravity is still at work in space, it's just lower. Third, we already have an energy-making thing in space, the sun. It's not stopping for another billion years, so easier and more efficient to just use the energy source that's right there. Space is not frictionless, space is just really empty, so there isn't much there that'll stop you from doing things. But the perpetual motion machine itself is not space, even if you put it in space. It still has moving parts and friction of its own, so it can't actually have perpetual motion or free energy. The issue with perpetual motion machines is not about friction slowing them down. It's that pulling energy out of them slows them down. Theoretically you can make something that spins forever, if you have a perfect environment. But the act of pulling energy from that system will slow it down. Voyager 1 and 2 are almost perpetual motion machines, in that we launched them very fast out of the solar system and they will likely continue for millennia. Of course, we can't extract any power from them without slowing them down, at which point they would no longer be perpetual motion machines. Electricity is generated by movement between magnets. If you have a perpetually moving object, like a freely spinning turbine in space, as soon as you apply a magnetic force to that to generate the electricity you are introducing the friction which will stop the object moving. You can't, sorta. If you launch something into space it will keep moving forever so long as it doesn't hit anything or get caught in any grav field. But how do you harness that momentum? When you try, you'll introduce some counterforce, and you're back in the same place. Even if you removed friction from the equation and somehow created a PMM, you couldn't harness it for endless energy without adding friction back in and it would cease to be a PMM. This is, obviously, ignoring how to actually create it in the first place. You can have something spin around for next to forever, but in order for that to be useful and generate electricity it has to run into resistance that the vacuum of space won't fix. Like friction with its own moving parts or electromagnetic resistance. Space might be, but the machine wouldn't be. Whatever parts would move and it would lose energy from friction. Or some other way, friction isn't really the problem. The same would happen if you wanted to take the energy from the machine. You can harvest free energy from the quantum flux. We just don't have the technology yet, or the technology is being hidden from us by the people in charge in order to protect the $60 trillion oil and gas infrastructure business. Even if it was frictionless I think that the energy invested will be max energy recuperated. Even if it was possible, there is no use to it. Assuming you would like to harvest more than invested. Closer than when on Earth with its gravity, but friction is always an issue. Perpetual only applies to the depressed mental condition as a human. Eat, drink, fornicate, and be merry. Because there's no such thing as a free lunch. X200b. When you take energy out of the system for use, you become the friction. Take enough out and the whole thing stops. Perpetual motion machines can't exist anywhere. The entire universe itself could be considered a machine and it will reach a point where it can do no more useful work. The materials that make up the machine rub against each other and still have friction between each other. In space you are just removing gravity and wind resistance. Well, it's not frictionless but pretty close, and there are effectively perpetual motion machines everywhere. In fact you're literally attached to one right now. There would still be friction between the moving parts of the machine in space. Space isn't frictionless, there's just nothing up there to have friction against. There is friction in space. Just look at those gas accretion disks around black holes. The gas, through the friction, gets heated to incredibly high temperatures. You can take a bowling ball into space, spin it, and it'll spin forever unless it hits something. Perpetual motion achieved. Doesn't do anything though. Anything that makes noise, flexes, gets warm, or moves anything unelastically is an energy consumer. and therefore can't be a perpetual motion machine. Why doesn't a moon in perfect orbit violate thermodynamics by creating infinite tidal energy over time?